Okay, welcome to another vlog series. In these vlogs, I turn on the camera, and usually kind of ramble incoherently for a long time, so fair warning. The nominal title of this vlog is Classic Books Which Have Sequels. So kind of these classic works of literature from the Western canon that actually have a lesser known sequel attached to them, or in some case an equally well-known sequel. That's the nominal title. I'm going to go on a few digressions, including kind of how I came to this subject matter, which is via another YouTuber, a guy with the handle of Dane Reads, whose YouTube channel I stumbled across a few weeks ago when I was looking for information on Bound for Glory. He wasn't reviewing Bound for Glory, but he was reviewing Bob Dylan's Chronicles, and he made the connections between Bob Dylan's Chronicles and Bound for Glory. And I believe I linked to his video in the description of my Bound for Glory review at the time. Since then, he's been nice enough to comment on some of my videos, and I've commented on some of his, and we've had a little bit of a back and forth going on. I'll link to his channel down below, of course. Right, so he was reading Robinson Crusoe. I guess I'll take a digression to talk about my experience with Robinson Crusoe. So Robinson Crusoe, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but there was a series of comic books with the audio cassette that were popular during the early 80s for kids. The comic books came from Marvel. Marvel had published like a series of kind of comic book versions of classic books, I think in the 70s. And then during the 80s, they took 6 of these and kind of edited them a little bit to make them kind of more kid-friendly, like simplified the language. And they had an audio tape that went with it, with kind of sound effects and dramatic music and voice actors and stuff like that. They did 6 of these. They did Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, Robin Hood, Frankenstein, Arabian Nights, and Alice in Wonderland. At my house, we eventually had the whole set. Treasure Island was my absolute favorite, but Robinson Crusoe, I think, was maybe a close second. I really enjoyed that one. So, in university, I was taking, I forget, a history of Western literature or something like that, and we were assigned to read Robinson Crusoe in that class, and I absolutely hated it. Which was kind of to my surprise, because I had enjoyed that comic book version as a kid so much. But, you know, as often happens with these classic books, it's a bit of a slog to read through the original, the old original edition. Comic book version is something completely different. That being said, it's a little bit odd, or maybe it's not odd. I still feel a lot of fondness for the story of Robinson Crusoe, just because of growing up with the comic book. And I still feel like some sort of ownership of that story, like Robinson Crusoe is one of my favorite stories, even though I didn't like the original novel. Probably a lot of us have some sort of story like that, right? Where we have some sort of sentimental attachment to a simplified version of a classic story, even though we found the original unsimplified version to be a hard slog. My main complaint with the unsimplified version is there were just too much details. Now, I mean, there are a number of action scenes in the story of Robinson Crusoe, and like in the comic book version, it was mostly action. There was a little bit of kind of description of the island. But when you're actually reading the novel, he's just kind of listing out his provisions, and he's talking about all the fortifications he makes, and he spends so much detail talking about how he arranged his cave and how he stocked his provisions and stuff like that, which just bored me to tears. And the rest of my class, we kind of all hated it. Dane Reads actually liked it. So, I mean, just goes to show that there are different people, different tastes. Could also be, the thought has occurred to me that maybe because I was already familiar with the story, it made reading the whole unabridged novel such a slog. Because like I had already had all the best parts spoiled for me. I don't know. Anyways, one of the interesting things I learned from reading this in a university class is as we were kind of studying this book, kind of like on the last day, the professor talked about the sequel to Robinson Crusoe. And I was like, what? There's a sequel? Yeah, who knew, huh? You know, again, this is a story that I considered to be kind of part of my childhood, having grown up with a comic. And kind of all these years kind of feeling like I had some sort of connection with the story and never knew that there was a sequel. And this is, yeah, this is interesting. And this is going to be kind of the topic of this video. I think there's quite a handful of classic books which you've heard a million times and you never knew they had a sequel. Anyways, Dane Reeds in his review was, among other things, near the end of the review, was talking about how the end of the book seemed to tease a sequel. And he says, you know, that's really, I forget his exact words, but he said, it's a bit lame to kind of tease a sequel when we all know there wasn't a sequel because they didn't do sequels back in those days. And at the risk of being a pedant, I ventured to type in the comments, actually, there is a sequel. I mean, I've never read it. My university professor essentially said, don't bother with the sequel. He knew we had all been bored with the original novel. And he said, if you thought the original novel was boring, he said, the sequel's even worse. He says, the sequel's largely just kind of the worst type of travelogue where he just kind of describes the places he went to. Yeah, actually, I was on Wikipedia just now, kind of looking up the Wikipedia summary of the sequel to Robinson Crusoe, which is called The Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe or something like that. And according to the Wikipedia summary, it does not look half bad. But then, of course, the original Robinson Crusoe does not look half bad. If you just take the plot, it's kind of all the boring detail that gets you down. So who knows? And I don't want to spoil anything here, for just in case somebody's out there who might want to read the sequel. But it does look like at least the first part of the sequel directly ties back in with the end of Robinson Crusoe's novel and kind of, well, to say too much would spoil it. But yeah, it looks like it's picking up right where Robinson Crusoe left off and kind of picking up a lot of old characters from the original novel or situations. And then he goes all the way off to Cambodia and Vietnam. I'm currently living in Vietnam now, so that's of interest to me. And into China, it sounds like it would be interesting, huh? One of these days, maybe I should just sit down and reread Robinson Crusoe and then go on to the sequel. I don't know. So anyways, I typed that into the comments, and Dane Reeds said, right, that's interesting. I wonder when they started doing sequels then. And I kind of typed back, I think they've always been doing sequels. Listed off a few examples off the top of my head, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, kind of that stuff. And then Dane Reeds responded, and he said, you should do a video on that. And my initial response was, no, I don't know enough to do a video on that. But then I thought, I don't know enough to talk about half the stuff I talk on this channel. Why not? Why not just turn on the camera and ramble a bit and just see if anything intelligent comes out? So that's the subject for today's video, is kind of classic books that have sequels. So the obvious example is kind of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Although this gets into a question of like, what is a sequel really, right? Because I I mean, like, in order to classify the Odyssey as a sequel to the Iliad, I guess you have to kind of take the traditional view that both of them were written by a person named Homer. So then you can imagine Homer, he's like in his house somewhere, and he's like, all right, come on, Homer. How are you going to follow up the Iliad? He's like, I know. I've got this great idea for a sequel to the Iliad that I'm going to write. So that's one scenario. But I think another quite popular view is that Homer didn't really exist. And that the Iliad and the Odyssey are both just kind of oral tradition that was kind of written down at one point. And so in that case, it makes it a little bit less clear that one's a direct sequel to another. And then the other complicating factor is, of course, Iliad and the Odyssey are part of a much larger cycle of epic poems about the Trojan War, most of which have been lost, but we know about kind of a lot of it from other sources. And so in that sense, it's not like first there was the Iliad and then Homer was thinking of a sequel and then he wrote the Odyssey. On the other hand, it is clear that the story of the Trojan War was growing a lot over time. So, you know, people sitting around campfires or whatever, adding more and more stories to the Trojan War, which is a form of sequel, maybe, depending on how you define sequel. I mean, I guess if you're defining sequel in terms of like modern publishing and marketing, then it's not then it's not. But in terms of expanding a story. And interestingly enough, the Trojan War also contains some examples of prequels. So I forget where I was reading this, but I was reading this somewhere on the internet. There's no mention in Homer of that whole story with the golden apple and Paris kind of choosing between the three gods, right? Remember that story? Paris has to choose between Aphrodite and Hera and Athena. And then as a reward for choosing Aphrodite, Aphrodite gives him Helen of Troy, right? That whole thing. There's no mention of that in any of Homer. Now, of course, Homer is writing about a different period of the war, but there's no kind of linking back or references to it. So people think that that whole thing came kind of sometime after Homer. And that would be an example of a prequel, maybe. Again, depending on how you define prequel. The other thing, talking about Greek myths here. Now again, these were much more oral traditions. So if we're defining sequel in the terms of like publishing a sequel, then I guess it doesn't count. But there are so many adventures of Theseus, there are so many adventures of Hercules, and then there are crossovers, right? Where like Theseus and Hercules were both on the adventure of the Golden Fleece, or Theseus gets caught in the underworld and Hercules rescues him. So there's obviously crossovers and spin-offs and all this kind of stuff going back to ancient Greek mythology. And then if you continue that to Roman mythology, Aeneas is kind of like the Roman spin-off from the Trojan War. I mean, Aeneas was in the Iliad, but Virgil kind of spun him off into a different character. Actually, sorry, if I'm going to be pedantic about this, the Legend of Aeneas existed long before Virgil, but Virgil wrote the book. Wikipedia, which is one of the places I went to kind of look up the origin of sequels, the Wikipedia article is disappointing, actually. They don't have a lot on there, which is why I'm kind of primarily going off of my own memory. Speaking of which, I should have made this disclaimer at the front of the video. I'm not an expert. I'm not a scholar. I'm just talking about stuff that I've read, but this is not intended to be a thorough treatment. This is just intended to be kind of off the top of my head. By all means, jump into the comments and correct me or add all the stuff I missed. Anyways, Wikipedia mentions kind of the Bible as an example of having sequels. Now, I think, again, this depends how we define a sequel, right? For example, in the Bible, there's 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but that is not actually a historical distinction. Originally, that was all just kind of one long book of Samuel that later I forget what time period, but somebody went in and divided it up later. So I don't think that quite counts as a sequel. There is kind of a long historical narrative in the Bible, but then, yeah. I guess here we get into a couple different questions. One is the accuracy of the biblical narrative. But then the other, I guess for the sake of argument, assume that the authors of the biblical narrative meant for it to be taken as a real history. And then the other question is like, what's the difference between a sequel and history, right? Because I think the authors of the biblical narrative meant for it to be taken as a history. So I don't know if you could really classify it as a sequel. This is a big can of worms, the accuracy of the Bible, and it's really like a whole different video, or a whole different series of videos, really. But my understanding is that the biblical narrative in 1st and 2nd Kings is based on kind of historical chronicles. They are changing the details around to fit a religious polemic, but it's based on real history. This is obviously going to be a matter of debate depending on your religious views. But I think the scholarly consensus is that in the Bible there are books that do not have any historical validity. So the book of Daniel, the book of Esther, and the book of Ruth are kind of classified as historical fiction. So if you read both of the books of Daniel and the books of Ruth, they're very carefully positioned in a historical time frame. Both of them are during the captivity. Daniel starts out during the Babylonian captivity and then goes into the Persian captivity, which, by the way, is one of the historical problems with Daniel because that's far too long of a time span for one person. That's a different subject. Ruth is during the Persian captivity, but they're written much later, and I think scholars say they're just kind of like historical fiction. Now, there are kind of sequels to the books of Daniel and the books of Ruth, right? Depending, again, so in the Protestants would classify this as the biblical apocrypha, and they would call it additions to the book of Daniel. So like there's a story in the additions to the book of Daniel in which there's like a dragon, and everyone is worshiping the dragon, and then Daniel feeds the dragon poison or something like that. But in the Greek Jewish tradition, the Septuagint, and I think in the Catholic traditions, they just include that as the book of Daniel. And I think this gets into another question with kind of old sequels, is what's the difference between a sequel and what's the difference between just adding on to the book? And that I think that question pops up with a number of these ones. Esther as well. There are additions to the book of Esther that the Protestants classify as like a separate apocryphal book. But I think in the Catholic Bibles, it's just kind of extra material in the book of Esther. Speaking of the Bible, arguably there's another example of a prequel in the Bible, and that is the book of Ruth. Ruth is like the grandmother of King David, but there's no reference to her in kind of the historical narrative of King David or anything afterwards. Scholars think that Ruth was kind of written in the period after the exile, and there's an interesting, there's an interesting video series on this by Christine Hayes at Yale University, right? You know, you can watch all those Yale University open courses online, right? So if you watch her series on the Old Testament, she fascinating series, by the way. She talks about how the book of Ruth was written at the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah. When there was in Ezra and Nehemiah, there's this racist polemic, or this racial purity polemic, saying that Jews have to be pure, do not intermarry with the Moabites. If there's a Moabite woman in your house, kick her out. And then all of a sudden, the book of Ruth, which is about a Jewish man marrying a Moabite woman, And then all of a sudden at the end of the book of Ruth, you find out, oh, and by the way, this was the grandmother of King David. That was actually written during the period of Esther and Nehemiah as a response to Esther and Nehemiah. But it was written as a prequel to kind of take place beforehand. Right. So, rambling on here a little bit. I guess one last example from the Bible. The one example maybe which would seem to be a clear case maybe of a sequel to me would be the combination of Luke and Acts. So Luke and Acts, whoever wrote it may not have been Luke, was written by the same person. And they both had the same kind of introduction. So they're both kind of addressed to the same person. What was his name? Theophanes or something. And Acts starts right off by the author saying, okay, in my last book, Theophanes, I wrote about this. Now I'm going to kind of continue the story of the apostles of Jesus Christ. So that's kind of a clear link where these kind of books are meant as a set. So arguably that's a sequel, except it's also meant to be presented as a historical narrative. So like, are historical narratives really sequels? Now I know people like me who are agnostics would be critical of the history value of that, but it, at the very least, it's meant to be presented as a historical narrative. Okay, so moving on, I guess. These are kind of other, I'm just going to jump around to famous sequels that I know. So there is Don Quixote, which I'm been slogging through now for over a year. It's a tough go. I'm halfway through it. Don Quixote, actually, if you pick this up in the bookstore, this is actually two books in one. There's Don Quixote 1 and there's Don Quixote 2 because there was a sequel published 12 years later. And the reason that Cervantes published a sequel was because somebody else wrote an unauthorized sequel to Don Quixote, which upset Cervantes. So he's like, no, I'm going to write the official sequel. And as you can see, I'm not done with it yet. I'm still slogging away at it. But in the sequel, there's some interesting stuff going on here. Because in the world of the sequel, the original Don Quixote book has already been published. So all the characters in Don Quixote 2 are referencing Don Quixote 1 and saying like, oh yeah, I read about that in your first book of adventures. So some clever stuff going on there. Now, here's another question. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, just about any edition of Don Quixote that you would buy nowadays contains Don Quixote 1 and 2. So they're not published as Don Quixote 1 and 2 nowadays. Nowadays it's just published as Don Quixote and it contains both books in one. So do we count this as a sequel? I mean, I guess it was a sequel at one point, but now it's just Don Quixote. And when people say, I'm reading Don Quixote or I've read Don Quixote, they're referring to both the book and the sequel because they're kind of like an inseparable pair. Another example that just kind of sprung to the top of my mind is Paradise Lost, which of course had a sequel, Paradise Regained, which I've not read. I read parts of Paradise Lost for university literature class and really struggled with it. I'm not sure I'm going to be returning to that anytime soon. Now moving on into kind of the 19th century, I think at this point publishing sequels became fairly common. So the Three Musketeers has a whole series of sequels to it. Here I have 20 Years After, which is the first book that's a sequel to the Three Musketeers. Now it depends whether you buy the French translation or the English translation. Original French or the English translation. I think there are 3 books in the original French and then 6 books in the English translation, just because that last book was so huge. The last of those 6 books in the English translation is The Man in the Iron Mask, which is an example maybe of a sequel that is equally as famous as the original book, maybe. I think Three Musketeers is a little bit more famous than The Man in the Iron Mask, but they're both kind of very recognizable classic book names. The other obvious example of a sequel which is equally famous with its original is Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. In fact, Huckleberry Finn is often cited as an example of a sequel which is more famous than the original. And at the moment, this is the only example I can think of a sequel which is more famous than the original. I don't know, maybe there are more examples out there. Let me know if I'm forgetting something. Yeah, what else? Oh, yeah. A lot of people don't know this actually, but in addition to Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, there are actually 2 more books in this series. There is Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective. So Mark Twain didn't stop at Huckleberry Finn. He kept going with kind of 2 more books, which are much less well known than Huckleberry Finn. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson has a sequel, which is called Catriona or something like that, which I read a few years back and hated it. I liked Kidnapped. I didn't like the sequel. Wizard of Oz. So this is all kind of in one volume here, but the complete stories of the Wizard of Oz. So there was like 12 stories or something that were written by Frank Baum. 12 or was it 18 or something? There was a lot of them. And then after he died, the publishers kind of continued the series with other authors. Moving on to stage plays. A lot of these Greek stage plays were written as trilogies, or at least a few of them. The ones that I know about were the Opetus trilogy. Opetus is the Opetus Rex, and then the Orestia trilogy. Now, when I was in in high school, we had to read Antigone, and we just read that on its own, but it's actually the 3rd part of the trilogy. So that, I know we're moving from books now into stage plays, but that obviously arguably counts as an example of sequels. Except again, there's this question. The Greek playwrights were not creating original stories, right? They were kind of going back to the myths that were popular during the time. So does it count as a sequel because they were just retelling a classic myth? I don't know. Shakespeare. Lots of Shakespeare plays were interconnected. So for example, Antony and Cleopatra had many of the same characters as Julius Caesar. But is it a sequel or is it just kind of 2 different history plays? I guess here again we get into the question of what's history and what's a sequel, and it gets even more complicated with historical fiction. But I think the most obvious example of interconnected Shakespeare plays are the Henriads. So he's got 2 of them. He's got one Henriad which kind of tells the War of the Roses, which is Henry the 6th part 1, Henry the 6th part 2, Henry the 6th part 3, and Richard the 2nd. And they all kind of form one cohesive play, even though they weren't actually, scholars don't think they were actually written in order. Like I think like Henry the 6th part 1 wasn't actually written before the other Henry plays. And then there's the other Henriad, which is kind of telling the story of Henry V, which is Richard II, Henry IV part 1, Henry IV part 2, and Henry V. Now, both of these are all kind of interrelated plays again, but of all these plays, the one that's most obviously a sequel is Henry IV part 2, because Shakespeare is going right back to the original setup he had in Henry IV part 1. And yes, it's also history, it's kind of a continuation of the history drama, but it's largely fiction. The kind of one of the main characters, sorry, the baby's crying. One of the main characters in this is Falstaff, which is, I'm going to move into the shower, that's my default whenever the baby cries. One of the main characters in here is Falstaff, which is loosely based on Old Staff, but is pretty much a fictional character. And in the original Henry IV Part 1, there's kind of this evolution